long before Dracula haunted the pages of world literature, long before Hollywood created its glamorized versions of vampires, the dark mountains of Romania were already whispering about creatures that defied death itself. In the misty valleys of the Carpathians, where the wind carries ancestral secrets, a millennia-old legend came to life through the terrifying accounts of peasants who swore they had seen the dead walking among the living. These were not the seductive vampires of modern films, but primitive and dreadful entities that embodied humanity's deepest fear, the impossibility of eternal rest. Today, you will uncover the true origin of vampires through the Romanian mythology of the Strigoi, creatures that preceded all other vampire legends in the world. We will explore how these supernatural beings shaped not only Romanian folklore, but also influenced the entire global vampire culture we know today. By the end of this journey, you will understand the fundamental differences between Hollywood vampires and their authentic origins, discover protection rituals used for centuries by Romanians, and understand how a local superstition turned into the most enduring cultural phenomenon in the history of horror. In the oldest traditions of Romania, even before the Christianization of the Dacian people, there were already accounts of spirits unable to find peace after death. The Strigoi were born from the convergence of the pre-Christian beliefs of the ancient Thracians and the Slavic influences that spread across the Balkans during the Great Migrations. Unlike modern vampires, the original Strigoi were not necessarily evil by nature, but rather troubled souls returning to the world of the living due to unresolved matters. The word Strigoi derives from the Latin strix, meaning owl or nocturnal bird, linking these creatures to omens of death that echoed through the dark forests of the region. The concept of Strigoi was deeply tied to ancient Romanian cosmology and its beliefs about the human soul. It was believed that the soul had multiple layers, and when a person died improperly or violently, certain parts of the soul remained trapped in the earthly realm. These spiritual fragments desperately sought to complete their journey to the afterlife, but were hindered by specific circumstances that left them in a state of agonizing limbo. Romanian elders identified particular signs that indicated when a soul would become a Strigoi: sudden deaths, suicides, murders, or deaths occurring during spiritually dangerous periods. Romania's mountainous geography significantly contributed to the development of these supernatural beliefs. The isolated valleys and dense forests created an environment where the supernatural seemed closer to everyday reality. During the long winters, when communities were cut off by snow, reports of apparitions and unexplainable phenomena multiplied, fueling an oral tradition that grew with each generation. The storms descending from the mountains were often associated with the presence of Strigoi, who were believed to travel with the icy winds, searching for victims or trying to deliver important messages to the living. The fundamental distinction between the Strigoi and other supernatural beings from world mythology lay in their deep connection to the Romanian land. They were not invaders or external demons, but an integral part of the people's cultural identity. This local character made the Strigoi both feared and respected, as they represented continuity between life and death, between the world of ancestors and that of descendants. Folk wisdom taught that understanding the Strigoi was essential for maintaining the balance between the visible and invisible worlds. Romanian mythology makes a crucial distinction between two fundamental types of Strigoi: the Strigoi living and the Strigoi morts, each possessing unique characteristics and powers that set them apart dramatically. The living Strigoi were people born with specific supernatural abilities, often identified by particular physical marks, such as heterochromia, pointed teeth, or a vestigial tail. These marks were not seen as deformities, but as signs of a special connection with the spiritual world, granting the individual powers that could be used either for good or for evil. Traditional Romanian society maintained an ambiguous relationship with living Strigoi, oscillating between fear and veneration. Living Strigoi possessed the ability to leave their bodies during sleep and travel in spiritual form, a skill known in modern esoteric traditions as astral projection. During these nocturnal journeys, they could visit others, influence dreams, drain vital energy, or even cause illness. Unlike Hollywood vampires, living Strigoi did not need to consume blood to survive, but fed on vital energy, intense emotions, or the willpower of their victims. This ability made them simultaneously healers and sorcerers, depending on how they chose to use their supernatural gifts.
The dead Strigoi, on the other hand, were individuals who returned after physical death due to specific circumstances that prevented their eternal rest. Unlike their living counterparts, dead Strigoi had reanimated physical bodies that displayed disturbing characteristics: pale but undecayed skin, superhuman strength, lack of reflection in mirrors, and an insatiable thirst for blood or vital energy. They retained many of the memories and personality traits they had in life, but these were corrupted by a supernatural hunger that turned them into relentless predators. Reanimation did not occur immediately after death, but gradually over several nights, allowing family members to observe signs of supernatural activity at the grave. The interaction between these two types of Strigoi created a complex dynamic within traditional Romanian society. Living Strigoi were often consulted to deal with problems caused by the dead Strigoi, creating a supernatural hierarchy in which the living served as intermediaries between the mortal world and the forces beyond death. This symbiotic relationship demonstrated how Romanian culture integrated the supernatural into its social structure, not as something external to be fought, but as a fundamental part of reality that needed to be understood and managed through ancestral knowledge and proper rituals. The process of transformation into a Strigoi was intimately connected to the circumstances of death and the funerary rituals performed by the community. When a person died violently by suicide or during periods considered spiritually dangerous, such as the new moon or certain pagan festivities, the chances of returning as a Strigoi increased drastically. The absence of proper funerary rituals or the presence of personal objects not buried with the deceased created spiritual anchors that prevented the soul from following its natural path to the afterlife. Gravediggers and priests developed specific protocols to identify potential Strigoi even during the wake, observing signs such as the position of the body, changes in skin coloration, or unusual atmospheric phenomena during the funeral.
The physical signs indicating the presence of a Strigoi were meticulously catalogued by Romanian folk wisdom over the centuries. A recently transformed dead Strigoi maintained a surprisingly healthy appearance for a corpse, with rosy skin, nails and hair that continued growing, and a serene facial expression that contrasted with the typical stiffness of death. During the first few weeks after burial, family members reported vivid dreams involving the deceased, experiences of sleep paralysis, or the sensation of an invisible presence in the home. Domestic animals, especially dogs and cats, displayed agitated behavior near the grave or refused to enter certain areas of the property where the Strigoi had lived. The physical traits that developed in an active Strigoi included elongated canines that were not necessarily sharp like fangs, but visibly larger than normal, eyes that glowed with their own light in the dark, and physical strength that greatly exceeded their capabilities in life. Witnesses described the skin of the Strigoi as having a translucent quality, especially under the moonlight, and a body temperature abnormally low, which could be felt even from a distance. The absence of reflection in mirrors and bodies of water was considered the definitive test, although few had the courage to perform such verification when they suspected they were facing a Strigoi. The identification of a living Strigoi followed completely different criteria, focusing on supernatural abilities demonstrated from birth or developed during adolescence. Children born with teeth, who spoke early about dead people they had never known, or who demonstrated impossible knowledge of distant events, were carefully observed by the community. The ability to heal or cause illness through touch, to predict deaths or disasters, and to communicate with animals were definitive indicators of Strigoi nature. These children were often isolated during certain lunar phases or religious festivities, when their powers intensified and could pose a danger to other members of the community. The powers of the Strigoi significantly transcended the limitations of the vampires popularized by modern culture, encompassing a spectrum of abilities that connected them deeply to the primordial forces of nature. The ability to metamorphose was perhaps the most impressive of these powers, allowing the Strigoi to assume the forms of wolves, bats, crows, or even atmospheric phenomena such as dense fog or freezing wind. This transformation was not merely physical, but involved a fundamental alteration of spiritual essence, enabling them to retain their consciousness and personality, regardless of the form assumed. The oldest accounts describe Strigoi who became entire storms, moving through the mountains like localized hurricanes that devastated specific properties.
Control over natural elements distinguished the Strigoi from other supernatural creatures, granting them authority over specific aspects of the physical world. They could summon devastating frosts in the height of summer, direct swarms of insects against specific enemies, or cause rivers to temporarily change their course. This elemental connection was not the result of learning or ritual, but a natural extension of their hybrid nature between life and death. The most powerful Strigoi were capable of influencing the weather across vast areas, creating microclimates of terror where nothing grew properly and animals behaved strangely, signaling their presence from miles away. The ability to drain vital energy represented the most dangerous aspect of the Strigoi's powers, operating through methods far more subtle than the simple vampiric bite. They could extract life force through prolonged eye contact, seemingly casual touch, or even through personal objects that had belonged to their victims. This draining was not always fatal, but left victims in a state of deep exhaustion, unexplained depression, or chronic illness that defied conventional treatments. Traditional Romanian healers developed specific techniques to identify victims of Strigoi draining, observing symptom patterns that did not follow the normal progression of known diseases. The mental influence power of the Strigoi surpassed simple hypnosis, allowing them to implant false memories, alter perceptions of reality, or force individuals to perform actions against their conscious will. This ability was particularly pronounced during sleep, when the victim's mental defenses were naturally lowered. Entire families could be manipulated simultaneously, creating situations where reality became fluid and people questioned their own sanity. The most experienced Strigoi could maintain multiple victims under influence for extended periods, building complex networks of control that spanned entire communities, manipulating social and political events according to their personal objectives. Protection against the Strigoi required profound knowledge passed down through generations of healers and priests, involving a complex combination of preventative rituals, sacred objects, and specific behavioral practices. Garlic, although popularized by modern vampire lore, was merely a minor component within a far more elaborate defensive arsenal that included region-specific herbs such as wild wormwood, vervain, and mandrake root harvested under a waning moon. These plants were combined into complex amulets that had to be renewed monthly, following lunar calendars that determined periods of heightened spiritual vulnerability. Preparing these talismans demanded not only the correct ingredients, but also the utterance of powerful words and ritual gestures to activate their protective properties.
Architectural methods of home protection represented a sophisticated defensive science, developed over centuries of forced coexistence with supernatural presences. Traditional Romanian houses were constructed following precise principles, including the orientation of the main entrance, the placement of windows, and the integration of protective elements within the very framework of the home. Blessed salt was mixed into the mortar of the foundations. Mirrors were strategically placed to create reflective fields that would disorient spiritual intruders, and specific symbols were carved into supporting beams during construction. These architectural modifications were considered as essential as structural integrity, embedding supernatural protection into the very conception of the household. Home purification rituals followed precise calendars based on lunar cycles and religious festivities, blending Christian elements with far older pagan traditions. Fumigation with specific incense made from local resins, sprinkling of holy water mixed with sea salt, and the controlled burning of personal objects belonging to a deceased individual suspected of becoming a Strigoi were standard procedures carried out by local specialists. During these rituals, the entire family was required to participate in specific prayers, abstain from activities such as sewing or food preparation, and observe partial fasting to show reverence for the spiritual forces at play. The efficacy of these rituals depended not only on correct technical execution, but also on the sincerity of faith and emotional commitment of those involved. Personal protection through amulets and behavioral practices formed the most intimate line of defense against Strigoi influence, requiring constant discipline and sensitivity to supernatural danger signs. Silver crucifixes were worn not just as religious symbols, but as instruments that amplified the wearer's spiritual energy, particularly if they had been blessed during eclipses or other significant astrological events. Daily practices such as avoiding walking alone during certain lunar phases, refraining from saying the names of the recently deceased after sunset, and maintaining specific morning prayer routines created energetic protection fields that made it more difficult for predatory entities to approach. These practices demanded behavioral adaptations that became second nature, integrating supernatural defense into daily life without causing chronic anxiety or debilitating paranoia. When preventive methods failed and the presence of a Strigoi became undeniable, the community turned to elimination rituals that represented some of the most complex and dangerous procedures in Romanian supernatural tradition. The exhumation of the suspected body was always conducted during the day, preferably at noon, when supernatural forces were believed to be at their weakest. This process required the presence of at least 3 witnesses in addition to the main executor, usually a priest with specific experience in supernatural matters. The body was meticulously examined for the characteristic signs of Strigoi transformation: unnatural preservation of tissues, continuous growth of hair and nails, presence of fresh blood, or altered positioning within the coffin. The world had teeth, and it could bite you with them any time it wanted, wrote Stephen King. And this was a moment when the villagers knew the fangs had found them. The process of neutralizing a dead Strigoi followed strict protocols, varying depending on the stage of transformation
and the specific type of supernatural activity demonstrated. In early stage cases, where the transformation was still developing, it was sufficient to reposition the body face down, place sacred objects such as crucifixes or garlic cloves in the mouth, and pierce the heart with a wooden stake, traditionally made from ash or oak cut during the new moon. In more advanced cases, complete decapitation was necessary, followed by the separate burning of the head and body. The ashes had to be dispersed into flowing water, a practice rooted in ancient beliefs that moving water disrupted any spiritual cohesion, preventing the reassembly of the undead essence. Evil is always possible, and goodness is eternally difficult, Anne Rice once wrote. These rituals were a testament to that eternal struggle. Eliminating living Strigoi presented unique challenges. These were individuals still technically alive, possessing rights within the community, even as their supernatural behaviors became increasingly destructive. The first approach was always an attempt at exorcism. Rituals that involved prolonged fasting, continuous prayers for periods of 9 days, and the use of sacred relics intended to sever the bond between the individual and their supernatural powers. These procedures were not only spiritually intense, but also psychologically and physically exhausting. Participants often experienced altered states of consciousness, prophetic visions, or supernatural manifestations that tested the limits of their faith and the very structure of reality as they knew it. In these moments, the thin veil between the mundane and the monstrous would tear, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with dread and revelation. When exorcism failed, the community faced the agonizing decision of physical elimination, a step that carried deep moral and spiritual implications. Executing a living Strigoi demanded specific methods designed to ensure that death would result in genuine spiritual release rather than transformation into a more powerful undead being. Techniques considered effective included drowning in holy water, live immolation preceded by purification rituals, or burial alive in consecrated ground. However, these methods were only deemed valid when conducted with the voluntary participation of the Strigoi themselves, who had to acknowledge the necessity of their own destruction for the greater good of the community. This kind of cooperation was exceedingly rare, making such executions extraordinarily uncommon. Yet when they did occur, they left indelible marks on the collective memory of the affected communities. The silence that followed was never peace, but the hush of something watching. From the dark, biding its time, waiting to see if the people would forget what they had once feared enough to face. The mythology of the Strigoi transcended its regional origins to become the very foundation upon which the entire global vampire culture was built, influencing not only literature and cinema, but also religious practices, anthropological studies, and even medical approaches to unexplained phenomena. When Bram Stoker crafted his iconic Dracula, he drew extensively from correspondence with Romanian historians and travelers' accounts who had documented authentic encounters with Strigoi. Stoker's literary transformation, while dramatized for Victorian audiences, preserved essential elements of the original mythos: the deep connection to native soil, the ability to shapeshift, the command over natural elements, and the necessity of specific rituals for definitive elimination. These aspects echoed through every page of his novel, building a Gothic edifice upon bones much older than modern horror. as Anne Rice would later write, the world was a tomb, and only the Strigoi remembered the way out. Historical documentation of Strigoi cases reveals intriguing patterns that suggest genuine phenomena behind the legends. These include official reports from local authorities, medical records of inexplicable epidemics, and sworn testimonies from multiple independent witnesses. During the 18th and 19th centuries, 18 and 19, as scientific methods began to be applied to supernatural phenomena, investigators discovered statistical correlations between Strigoi outbreaks and specific environmental conditions. Geological shifts, minor seismic activity, fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field, and even cycles of solar activity. These findings hinted at the possibility that Strigoi might be manifestations of natural forces not yet fully understood by conventional science. It was no longer about superstition. It was about evidence that pointed to something ancient and hidden, something real. And yet, in the shadows, they remained watchers, waiting. The evolution of the Strigoi mythology throughout history demonstrates how oral traditions adapt to social and technological change while preserving their spiritual essence. During times of war and political instability, Strigoi reports surged dramatically, often associated with fallen soldiers returning to protect loved ones or avenge unresolved injustices. The two great world wars, those gaping wounds in the body of the 20th century, generated waves of reported Strigoi activity across the Balkans. These accounts bore features adapted to modern contexts: apparitions in military uniforms, spectral interference through primitive communication equipment, and inexplicable influence over motorized vehicles and mechanical systems. It was as if the dead had learned to haunt the machines of the living, twisting progress into new channels of fear. The battlefield no longer ended at the grave. The contemporary legacy of the Strigoi is not confined to popular culture. It penetrates deep into modern approaches to complex psychological and sociological phenomena. Psychologists study Strigoi reports as manifestations of collective trauma, processed through supernatural narrative frameworks. Anthropologists interpret these traditions as sophisticated social control mechanisms, while even theoretical physicists find parallels between Strigoi abilities and concepts such as astral projection, non-local quantum influence, and the manipulation of energetic fields. This interdisciplinary lens reveals that the Strigoi are far more than primitive superstition. They are a complex system of knowledge about reality's hidden strata, realms which modern science is only just beginning to glimpse. The mythology continues to evolve, adapting itself to new scientific paradigms while maintaining its core function: to act as a bridge between the known and the mysterious, between life and death, between the material world and the dimensions that lurk just beyond ordinary perception. There are things more ancient than the stars, said a forgotten scholar of the dark, and some of them walk among us still. The shadows of the Carpathians still guard secrets that humanity has not yet dared to confront. The Strigoi are not merely relics of a superstitious past. They are echoes of a truth that lingers in the borderlands between our world and the realm that lies beyond death. Today, you discovered that the vampires we think we know are only distorted reflections of something much older and far more powerful. If these revelations have awakened your thirst for knowledge about the darkest mysteries of humanity, then you have found your refuge. The Ark of Mysteries is your portal to the truths that official history prefers to forget, to the revelations that slumber in the darkness, waiting for brave minds to awaken them. Subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell, for every week we dive deeper into the abyss of the unknown. Leave a comment telling us which dark mystery you would like us to unveil in our next journey. Perhaps it will be your suggestion that leads us through the next shadows. And remember, some knowledge changes forever those who possess it. Do you have the courage to keep going with us until our next descent into the unknown? If you can sleep after what you've learned today,